As we go out and do evaluations in Central Texas and support speech pathologists with the evaluations that we're doing, and we're reviewing reports and working with students who come from a multiple of language backgrounds, there are a handful of evaluations that we see that are DNQs, that do not qualify. And what we found over time is that there are some patterns as to which children will probably, predictably, be a DNQ and which kids won't. This is really good news because we can take this news and this information and look at our caseload in terms of how we could judge whether a child would be a good candidate for a reevaluation to possibly get them off our caseload. We know that we don't want to be signing kids up for evaluations only to have them still qualify. Yes, it might be the best decision to do at the time, and we'll definitely get good new goals out of it, but I also know it's a ton of work. So here are the 9 ways in which children who probably shouldn't be on a caseload have been moving along and what to look for. If you have any of these kids on your caseload, consider bringing them up for testing. And we'll talk at the end about what to do to really ensure that they probably won't qualify. Okay? Number 1, their 3-year reevaluation was skipped. In many states, school districts have the ability to skip past secondary eval. What this looks like is a child hasn't had an initial eval, maybe kindergarten, maybe pre-K, and then 3 years down the road, the professional says, oh, you know, they're still going to qualify. Let's just update the paperwork and the goals and not do a full evaluation. Super cool if you're dealing with a disorder like autism or Down syndrome, but for the 85% of our students that are only speech and language or may have an additional label unrelated, like a learning disability, this really isn't good practice, because what we found is that testing a child at age 4 and then going forward for basically double their lifespan can result in them not qualifying. Secondly, they just may not have had the best evaluation in the first place, and we don't know because, I mean, it may not have been us. So if you're up for reevaluation and the child didn't really have a full last one, chances are they would be a good candidate for a new evaluation. Number 2, duplication of services. So this one primarily applies to 3rd through 5th grade students who largely have goals around language and specifically narration. So our narrative goals, if you look at your state's Common Core or the knowledge and skills database or whatever your state uses, our narrative goals are almost identical to the English Language Arts School. So if you have a student who's older and that's the last thing they're working on and they have another label such as a learning disability, chances are they can be supported in the special education classroom. Number 3, they were bilingual, but they don't speak the second language anymore. A lot of times you look at the paperwork of a child, and when they were tested at age 3 or 4 or 5, there was heavy influence of Armenian or Mandarin or Arabic in the house. Fast forward half a decade, and they just had no exposure and no use of it, and they're actually an English speaker now. So the first testing done with an interpreter or in a bilingual fashion that had to consider both languages at a time when the child was trying to figure out English and Spanish, that really doesn't apply anymore, and they need fresh testing, which might only be in English. This is common for Spanish, but it's even more common if you have a smaller language group like Hmong or Igbo or Armenian, where there are no cultural centers and there is no one else in their community or their neighborhood that speaks that language. Their acquisition of English is much faster. Number 4, they're bilingual, but they've passed 7 years of language use. So language is on our side with language testing versus our diagnosticians who do academic testing. As the child is just on the planet year after year after year, they're getting more exposure and use of language. So with zero intervention, a child's communication improves typically. So if you've waited a long time, regardless of what the prior scores say, they may be within normal limits. And we're talking that the first evaluation, maybe they had standardized scores of 60, 65. And then in Spanish, as an example, I've easily tested tons of kids and they've been in the 78 to 82 standard score. Not superior language, but definitely typical for their class and their grade level. We don't have the standard tests in the other languages other than Spanish, but I think that the results are still the same, that these kids, even more so in Spanish because they may not have a community that's supporting their second language, are moving through and developing English at a faster rate and need better English testing. Number 5, the CELF and other formal tests support natural language acquisition. So not only is language getting better, but our tests eventually only top out. Like a 4th grade, a 6th grade student has the language that's needed for the majority of the rest of their life. It's developed enough. So as the child's getting older, oftentimes I've heard speech pathologists share that they don't want to give the standardized testing to a bilingual child because the grades will be low. The scores will be low. I am so surprised so often that I give an English CELF or IELTS or Caseload to like a 5th grade bilingual student and they do fine. They're within normal limits. So the message here is don't be afraid of the standardized testing. This isn't true for our diagnostician brothers and sisters that are working in special education. For every year, academics gets harder and harder and harder. And if a child is plateauing in their academic abilities, the test still gets harder, but that's not really true of us. So don't be afraid of our standardized tests, especially with these older kids. Go ahead and give them. I think you'll be surprised by the results. Number 6, your caseload is enormous. It is true that many of us are under duress with the number of kids that we're seeing. And what this means is the idea of bringing an extra evaluation on ourselves for a child that needs to go just seems like a ton more work. And it's quixotic, right? Because the one thing we need more than anything is less kids, and these kids off our caseload. So the idea that leaving a child on our caseload produces less work, I think it relieves maybe some temporary pain. But in long term, if you add up all the progress notes and data and going to get the child, and then the fact that in certain years you have to test them anyway, having an enormous caseload makes it difficult to test, but can you find one child to remove from your caseload? The best way to go about doing this is to address evaluations in the fall. So the fall is a lot easier than the spring by tons and tons of measures in terms of the meetings and the availability of the kids and the amount of evaluations that we have done. So as you start your fall, if you can identify all the kids that you have to reevaluate anyhow, so you have to do these evaluations and you move them forward, you could remove them from your caseload rather than just working for them for several months. And if there's other kids that are just obviously coming back from summer and are doing great, try to get them signed up earlier. It's easier in the fall than in the spring. Number 7, some students behave really well. These are the students that we have on our caseload that are speech helpers, and they're really, really fun and enjoyable to be with. They're not a problem. The problem kids, the ones with behavior issues, the ones that take up more of our time, those are the ones we're currently focusing on. And we can have kids who are just shy or introverted or quiet or behaved, humming along with really good language, and they don't, how do I say this? They're not on our radar of difficulty or what we focus on throughout the day. So we're less likely to choose them for reevaluation until their time comes up, when they might be humming along and they're figuring things out, behaving because they have typical communication. Number 8, standardized academic testing creates a roadblock for speech reevaluations. How many of you have had as a 3rd, 4th, 5th grade child who you think needs to move off your speech caseload? You might be convinced, but it's a battle with the administration because they have accommodations, which is supporting them for whatever their testing is. Very difficult situation. So 2 things I'll say. One is that this is a perfect situation to reduce their services, either by reducing their 60 minutes to 30 or their 30 to 15 or 15 to consult, and letting the school know, look, I hear what you're saying, but you need to get the other testing in place if you have other concerns about his reading, writing, or math. These students are difficult to move up, and if you don't do that, if you don't fight the good fight, Our professional colleagues in the middle schools are spending the first part of their fall dismissing all the students that us early education professionals and elementary school professionals have pushed up to their level. So they would appreciate getting less of these. And number 9, we suffer under our own caution. If you've ever given an evaluation and it comes down right on the line, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this guy should be on or shouldn't be on. And there's something odd about it. It might be cluttering or stuttering. It's oftentimes a bilingual situation. We will err on the side of generosity and caution and put them on a caseload more often than times than we will take them off. When the truth is, children with communication disorders are 8 to 12% of the population, meaning that if you test a child, there's a 90% chance that he should not be on your caseload. This is a perfect situation to call in a friend. Call or find out who is an expert in that area and ask them to take a look at it. For example, I get evaluations all the time of bilingual kids, and I've done them so much, I'm like, oh yeah, this is fine, that's not fine. And it's easy for me to make the call. But when I have to make decisions about AAC or about Down syndrome or about cluttering and fluency and stuttering, like I need to lean on people where that is the thing that they love, and they can say, yeah, this is exactly where it is, put them on, here's some great goals, or I'm not sure, or yeah, definitely not, this guy does not need services. So lean on your friends. So if you have children on your caseload that fall into these camps, we challenge you to find one and move through the process of moving them off your caseload.